Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here again with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Been a while since we've recorded. Always good to connect with you. Looking forward to this. But today you're going to lead us off with a discussion around Florida, Walt Disney World, motels, and poverty.
Yes, good morning to you, Todd. It's great to be with you. So my today's story comes from the underbelly of our society where no one wants to look. On a recent international flight, I had a chance to see this remarkable, thought-provoking, gut-wrenching, and yet warm and tender movie called The Florida Project. When a talented storyteller like the director Sean Baker takes interest in the lives of those who are surviving on the society's fringes, something magical happens, and it's so evident in this movie. The story takes place near Walt Disney in the state of Florida, which is, of course, synonymous with magic and childhood dreams, and it invokes a sense of wonder and innocence. But this movie is far from that. It's a docudrama style movie which captures a story of lives of very, very, very poor, trapped in the circumstances and doing what they know or can just to live or survive. The movie follows the lives of two people, a happy-go-lucky 6-year-old girl, Mooney, and her very, very young and wild, impetuous, impulsive, and temperamental mother, Hallie. She is raised by a mother who herself was a teenager when she had this child, and probably grew up with very similar environment herself, never receiving guidance or assistance, how to handle emotions or roadblocks or how to handle even people. So the movie lets you peek into the lives of those who have nothing, no guidance, no safety net, no resources, no protection, or not even a glimmer of hope that there is going to be a way out of this deep well of never-ending trauma or torture. As you watch Mooney's days filled with aimless, unsupervised, risky explorations of the world around her and reckless and irresponsible parenting of Mooney's mom, you start feeling a sense of urgency and sadness take over you, This is a potential first grader who's on a summer break, and so many scenes show her talking back to adults, spitting on neighbors' cars, throwing water balloons at the patrons of the motel, getting into adult business, witnessing her mom's reckless behaviors, and trying to make a sense of it all. You can tell this is a very bright and capable child and very intelligent, but you also you can't help notice that the poverty is robbing Mooney from shaping her talents that can open doors for her. It's really a great depiction of lack of normalcy and how every child has a right to grow up and enter this world with limitless possibilities, fair and square, and that just doesn't exist with Mooney. So the question is, why am I talking about the Florida Project? Because poverty and chronic stress, education, and executive function are all close cousins, and we need to see how that impacts learning and the ability to develop a sense of independence and, self-autonomy. So that's why this brings me to a dear, dear friend and a colleague and even a local celebrity, Julie Washington. She is our guest today. Dr. Julie Washington is a professor in the Department of Education, Psychology, Special Education, and Communication Disorders in the College of Education and Human Development at Georgia State University in Atlanta here. She also is the Director of Communication Sciences and Disorders Program. Dr. Washington is an affiliate faculty of Georgia State University's Center for Research on the Challenges of Acquiring Language and Literacy. She is currently working on understanding the role of cultural dialect in the identification of learning disabilities in school-age children, particularly African American children, and disentangling the relationship between language production, comprehension, on development and reading skills. Dr. Washington's research program is funded by the National Institute of Health, Eugene Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. She's at heart a fabulous speech and language pathologist and a brilliant researcher, and I can't wait to have a conversation with her, Todd.
Yeah, no, gosh, just listening to you describe that film, The Florida project, I felt frustrated. So, it's going to be a fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to it. Let's get to it. This promises to be a critically important episode and something a little different than we've talked about on this show before. So looking forward to it. Let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's conversation with Dr. Julie Washington.
Julie, welcome to the podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you. As a fellow speech and language pathologist, I'm incredibly inspired by your commitment to excellence as you bring attention to the nature of emergent literacy skills in high-risk populations. So if I can start right there, who is this high-risk or at-risk population, and what burdens do they face as they navigate the complexities of everyday life?
Hi, Sucheta. I'm happy to be here. And I think that many people may define high risk differently, but my definition revolves around poverty and difficulties that come from growing up in an impoverished environment. And so poverty is a real concern in the United States. The last measurement by the National Center for Education Statistics and the U.S. Census Bureau talked about 12% of the U.S. population is growing up in poverty. And that number is exacerbated if you are from a minority background. So, for example, 12% of the population is considered to be growing up in poverty according to the federal government's poverty guidelines. But among African American people, almost 30% are growing up in poverty. And so that is more than twice the national average. And so with that disproportionate poverty comes a lot of social, educational, employment concerns that we have to deal with as a nation. Also, I'd like to say that when we talk about poverty, we talk about it like it's dichotomous. So you're either impoverished or you're not. But even within the poverty category, there are children and families who are considered to be more poor than others. And these families are talked about as being in deep poverty. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that someone who is in deep poverty is a family or a child whose income is below 50% of the poverty threshold. So they meet the poverty threshold, and if you will, they exceed it by 50%. So they are deeply poor. And these individuals represent about 6% of the total population and almost half of people who are living in poverty. And so this is not a small group of people. And what we see in that population is that we see a lot of difficulty with some of the things that the rest of us take for granted, like affordable housing. A lot of these families are experiencing food insecurity. Many of them are not employed because they're not very well educated. And as a result of all those other things, they are often living in communities where the schools aren't very good. And, we talk about a lot of things as they relate to education related to schools, and schools get blamed for a lot of things. But the reality is that often the quality of a school is directly related to the community that it's in. And so a lot of the issues that we face in our schools as they relate to children who are high risk are more related to other things that we can't control, like affordable housing. And so a lot of the issues that we see in our schools that we consider school problems are actually housing problems. So, for example, a lot of the neighborhoods that you'll see in our community are densely poor and highly segregated. That's a housing issue. So families are living in the areas that they can afford to live in. They come to schools where teachers and principals are really committed to them, but they also bring a lot of concerns to the classroom that teachers are having to deal with above and beyond just reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Yeah, and I think this is I'm going to come to this question about busting some poverty myths, but I think it's such a complex matter, and the average person's attitude towards that is somebody's already either taking care of it or it is not my problem. So can we talk a little bit about poverty itself? I read the book Evicted, Poverty and Profit in America, written by Matthew Desmond. He's a sociologist from Harvard, and he paints a really rich and complex picture of the factors that shape the American landscape of poverty. And So there are two common myths that surface, and I'm going to circle back and connect all this to executive function. But one is the characteristic of laziness, and second is bad choices.
Yeah.
And I really feel deeply about how it's kind of roped into somehow poverty is a choice, and poverty also is a reflection of poor moral compass or poor or some certain set of skills, apparently, that you should be innately gifted with. So could you comment a little bit about this whole our relationship to the idea of poverty?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really judgmental myths out there about people growing up in poverty. And I tend to believe that it is directly related to our bootstrap mentality in the United States. That as a country, many of us and our ancestors came to the country with little or nothing and have pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and are now doing much, much better. And some of us are doing very well. And I think when you live in a society like that, it's easy to believe that those who are living in poverty are just the ones who are not working hard enough, who are not taking advantage of this ability to pull yourself up from your bootstraps in this country. And they become the people who just didn't work hard enough, just didn't try hard enough, are lazy, want to be on public money, that kind of thing. Instead of developing empathy for people who are growing up in poverty, we have disdain for them and we demonize them. I'm a professor at Georgia State University, as you know, and the first semester that I was here, one of the things that I do in one of my undergraduate classes is I give them a series of essays that they can write on particular topics. And one of the topics that people often pick is one related to language development and poverty. And in that question, I talk about, because we've already talked about some in class, some of the influences on language development. And so I present poverty as one of the significant influences on how robustly language develops in children. And I was really shocked when I gave that assignment and got back all these papers from these very young people who are being educated themselves, who were talking about how, language development is negatively impacted because the mothers are lazy and they won't go get a job and they don't spend enough time with their kids and they don't care about education. It was all so judgmental and negative that I was so disturbed by it. And so I went back to class and I started this, sort of went in there and started this, soapbox kind of railing at them like, oh my God, how are you going to work with people when you have no respect for them and where they come from? And about halfway through my rant, I thought, this is not useful. I need to think about a different way to address this. And so I said to the class, I said that to them. I need to find a different way to address this. I know this is not helpful. I'm not trying to shame you because you have these viewpoints. What I want to do is disavow you of these beliefs that you have about poor people. And so what I decided to do, which was very helpful to them, you were talking about the book that you read. I set up in the class as extra credit, kind of a book club, where I carefully chose 4 books where the families and the children were in poverty for different reasons. So there was generational poverty. There was poverty because parents were mentally ill. There were all kinds of different issues across these books. And then we got together. Each student got to choose which book they wanted to read. And then we got together and we discussed them like a book club. And it was really an aha moment for the students to look into the lives in these biographies and autobiographies of people who had been impacted by poverty and realize that it wasn't their fault.
Such a powerful exercise. Truly, I think you tugged on their emotions to really understand the situation and then becoming informed and then becoming the driving force for change.
Yes.
This reminds me of Martin Luther King's, Poor People's Campaign that he ran. And one of his, the favorite quote that I love is, bootless man cannot lift himself by his bootstraps.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate this big picture of poverty and invisibility of this poverty. I'm born and raised in India, and people always ask, particularly in my American friends often say, there's so many poor people in India, and how do you live with that? And I always find it amusing because I think the poverty to American is invisible, but also I think in America, a poor person has a television set, and that does not mean they're not poor. So,
Right.
how does this really impact executive function and development of executive function, as well as the trajectory of, the gradual change that the brain undergoes as you develop the executive function proficiency?
Well, as you know, several of our colleagues, most in psychology, are talking about toxic stress. And the idea of toxic stress is that among children growing up in impoverished homes, that there's all this sort of chaos around them. It's a stressful environment. That's the idea. So there's a lot of noise, there's violence, there's not a lot of structure, there's a lot of uncertainty. You're not sure whether you're going to eat today, or if you do eat, whether you're going to eat to satiety or whether you're going to still be hungry, whether you will have a place to live tomorrow. And so that kind of stress in a child's life is toxic and it changes the brain. And so this research shows that by the time these kids get to preschool, that the brain architecture has changed in response to this environment that they live in. And whereas we see this as a uniformly, I think, in the literature as a negative thing, the brain is a wondrous organ. It changes in response to your environment to help you thrive and survive in it. And so what really has happened for these kids is that their brains have changed because the brain says, okay, this is the place where we have to live and survive. And in order for you to do that, I need to make some changes. And so the brain architecture changes and it protects them. So it's like a protective factor. The difficulty for those kids is when they leave home and go to school. And so when we see these kids in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, who have been in these environments where, their brain has already made these adaptive changes to help them to survive in all this noise and to be functional and, not be so stressed out that they can't function in the environment. Then they come to school and the whole landscape changes. Now we want you to sit down, be quiet, be focused. We're much more structured. We have expectations of you that you've never experienced before. And not only do we see that, the brain is not organized for this kind of environment, but also that the kids are not always sure what to do in it. And so they bring the whatever behavior experiences they have at home, come to school with them. I saw a documentary recently and it was about football. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a big football fan. And it was about a university in the West that went to these housing projects, and they recruited all these really fantastic athletes, and they brought them back to the university. And not surprisingly, within a year or two, there were all these problems and a lot of contact with the law, a lot of conflict between the football players and the other people on campus. And one of the things that the coach said was that when you bring people from the environment, you bring the environment with the people. And that's what happens with kids. So they go into the school and whatever environment they came from, they bring with them. So what we hear a lot in research is that these kids have significant behavior problems. They don't sit still. They're not very controlled. They don't have a lot of emotion regulation. And so the school becomes the sort of the chaotic place that they're used to. And so that's, kind of the conversation about executive function. As you know, my belief is that we can't just talk about behavior like it's some kind of anomaly or a problem that a child brings, but it's the skills to function in the classroom that they don't have. And, where would they get them from? I heard a teacher say to me once, they don't even know how to stand in line. I'm like, where would you learn that when you're 4?
Exactly.
expect you to stand in line until you show up at school. And if standing in line is a value at school, then teach them how to stand in line instead of demonizing them because they can't, or pathologizing their behavior. School is a place where we teach a lot of things, and some of the things we're finding that we have to teach kids in poverty are not just related to the curriculum.
This again, what a beautiful concepts you're laying down. I think one of the things I read somewhere that poverty is not a disability. And I think poverty is not a disadvantage in terms of human potential, but it is a certain disadvantage when it comes to contextual benefit that an average child gets from being raised by two parents or having educated parents or having all three or four meals taken care of or having, as you mentioned, sleep or noiseless environment. I was reading another, the Gary Evans book, The Chaos and Its Influence on Child's Development. And they, a lot of research articles that were talking about simply children who, they studied this children in Germany, those who grew up next to the airport and those who grew up in the suburbs, if they controlled for even, household income, they found that children who grew up with that extreme noise certainly had difficulty with attention. So, we know these kinds of, factors that bring in stability and anchor to child's sense of self and security are not even afforded to children in poverty.
No, right. Yeah, there was a study similarly. I don't know who the author was off the top of my head, who did a study like that in some of those low-income high-rises in New York City. And what they did was look at the test scores for kids and compare them to the times that shootings had occurred in the building. And what they found was that performance in the classroom significantly decreased for all the kids who lived in that building at the time that some major violent act had taken place. And they used that to show how when we're talking about educating children in our schools, that they are bringing the stress and the trauma from home into the classroom. And one of the things we're starting to hear people who work in urban environments talk about a lot more, there's a developing literature on trauma-informed education and what it means to grow up in a traumatic environment or an environment that traumatizes you and then come to school and try to learn. And it talks about how not only do the kids have to adapt, but the school needs to adapt around them to be able to accommodate their needs given the environments that they come from. And I had this conversation with some teachers recently, and to their credit, some of the school districts are starting to do professional development for teachers because where there is student trauma, there are traumatized teachers also. And we never think about them.
Absolutely. So, Julie, let's talk about your next area of interest, which is, you are looking at disentangling or separating this issues such as language production and comprehension and its impact on reading skills in children who are growing up in poverty. So, what are some of the distinct characteristics of a language profile of these children as compared to inputs a norm, typical children? And then also, how does that correlate to reading skills?
One of the things that we're really dealing with in our research is that impoverished language looks a lot like language disorder, and our instruments can't tell the difference. So when you encounter a child who's growing up in poverty, they often have reduced vocabulary size in terms of expressive vocabulary. Those are the words that they produce. And then receptive vocabulary, the words they comprehend, is also smaller than for kids who are not growing up in that environment. Their language development overall, so sentence structure is often impacted. So we don't see the same level of complexity, so on and on. So these differences that we see in this population really kind of mirror language in impaired populations. And that has been a real struggle for us in terms of figuring out how to tell the difference between kids who are having difficulty because of resources or because they're language impaired. And, sometimes people will say to me, well, does it really matter what the reason is, doesn't it just matter that you give them better language? And the response to that is that kids who have language impairments need a very different approach than kids who need language enrichment. And kids who are impoverished need language enrichment. They need more language. They need better language. They need more abstract and advanced language. Whereas kids who are impaired need language intervention just to develop, sort of this strong foundational language. And so these kids are not impaired, but they do look like kids who are impaired. And so, we know that for children who have true clinical language impairments, 50% or more of them will have reading problems. And we see the same thing in this impoverished group, except interestingly to even a greater extent. So when we look at the national statistics for African American kids, and I always talk about African American kids because that's who I study. When we look at African American kids at fourth grade, the most recent National Assessment of Education Progress, which is often called the nation's report card, reported that 83% of fourth grade African American children are reading at a basic level or below, and only 17% are reading at grade level, are considered proficient readers. That is unbelievable. That's more than 3 out of 4 kids. It's like 8 out of 10 who are not reading at grade level. And remember, this is a population that's disproportionately poor. So some of these statistics that we see have poverty sort of entangled into poor reading outcomes. And in our own research here at Georgia State, we do see significant differences between kids growing up in poverty and those who aren't, related not only to reading, but also to language, and then the way that language impacts their reading. So one of my interests, of course, is dialect variation. So it is the language forms that are used particularly by African American kids that are used in the community. So it's a community language system. A lot of people talk about standard American English. There's really no such thing. There is sort of a general American English system that we think is the standard, but probably 99.9% of people in the United States speak some kind of dialect of English. And for African American kids, there is this dialect as well. And the dialect is not a written form. It's only used orally. And we find that kids who use the most dialect are the kids who are having the most trouble learning to read. In some ways, they look like kids who are English language learners, where their linguistic system is so far away from the school standard that their reading is really poor. And so we see in these kids, then we have this cultural language system that's really different from literate language. And then we have an impoverished language system on top of that. And what we end up with is a significant number of kids who are not reading, and who, by the time they get to 4th and 5th grade, where they need to take the skills that they learned in the early grades in reading and use those skills to learn new things, those kids are so far behind that they're not able to use their reading skills to master new concepts.
So, Julie, is this then true? I've been hearing a lot about that the 3rd grade reading failure is directly correlated to the number of prisons we are building in this country.
Yes, that's a terrible statistic. And at first I didn't believe it. I was hoping it was an urban myth.
But it's not, isn't it?
It's not. That when a community decides to build a prison and they are trying to make decisions about how many beds there should be in the prison, one of the variables that they use is what percentage of children in 3rd grade in the community are reading at grade level. Because we know that the consequences of not being literate in this country, we value literacy in this country, and success really doesn't come if you're not really literate. And so for children who never learn to read at grade level, we see it, it's like a developmental cascade where it just keeps getting worse and worse every year, so that by the time they graduate, or if they graduate, or by the time they drop out is more like it, then we are talking about individuals who are not able to be gainfully employed, are not able to be involved in programs where they can get skills that allow them to be employed. And we see a lot of crime in impoverished communities as a result. You can't work, you can't buy what you need. And so we see people turn to a life of crime. And so, yes, that third grade reading issue, it's a huge issue, both educationally and societally. I mean, the cost of illiteracy in this country is tremendous.
So as we come to the end of this segment, Julie, can you make a compelling argument as to why should we care as a community? And, I see particularly after moving to Atlanta, and I shouldn't say that I was not exposed in Boston, but it has become much more clearer that there is a certain segregation in the way public schools and private schools operate, and if you belong to certain districts and the schools are, in quotes, good, then the parents are sending them. Otherwise, they're choosing private schools over public schools. But I think ultimately, to me, it's a matter of how do we educate our next generation. And it is a deeply disturbing issue to me that why are we not vested in understanding the needs of the population that you are researching? And so help us make a great appeal as to why we should care about these issues and the skill set, whether it's language, literacy, or executive function, and development of these skills in children who are growing up in poverty.
I wish I had like kumbaya kind of answer to that question, but I don't.
That's very disappointing. I was really hoping you would.
I know, right? So I do think that all the things that you've said have contributed to why we don't think it's about us, right? And so there's a researcher at Stanford who looks at poverty, and he looks at the top 90% and the bottom 90%. His name is Sean Reardon. And his research is very compelling. And some of the things he does have gone back like 70 years. And one of the things he's shown is that we've been really focused on race when it comes to education. And the rifts between the poorest and the most wealthy citizens in this country has gotten bigger and bigger over the last approximately 7 decades. So that now there's this huge gap between the individuals in the top 90% and those at the bottom 10%. And then in the middle, those kids who are sort of at the 50th percentile, I would say, are also starting to look very different from the kids at the top. And that's the top of income. And the top of income in this country really relates to education. So in the United States, you can buy a fantastic education. If you can afford a private school, if you can afford all of the supplemental things that cause kids to thrive, you can do really well in this country. But for children who don't have those kinds of resources, poverty is deepening, and they are becoming less and less disengaged. And so that is a problem for us as a society. We can't afford to have a rift between the middle class, the upper middle class, the upper class, and people who are growing up in poverty. It's one of the reasons that the United States has so many prisons, because instead of dealing with the problem, we just lock everybody up. And the rest of the world doesn't look like that. And at some point, it's going to explode on us. And so it makes a lot more sense for us as a society to look for the answers and how we educate all children. Even when a child brings all these issues to school, education is a civil right. Literacy is a civil right, and particularly in a country where being educated is what makes the difference between success and failure. We have a responsibility not only to these poor kids and their families, but we have a responsibility to ourselves as a society to care enough to try to make our society healthy instead of just creating all these silos that allow us to feel like to ignore it and turn our backs on it. Because you know what? At some point, these things will turn you around. You don't get to keep turning your back on it. They will continue to grow, and at some point, they will get out of control. And no matter where you live or how much education you have, you will be touched by them. And so if for no other reason, self-preservation, that we need to care because it's getting to be more and more of an issue. We look at like the opioid epidemic and all these things that are starting to touch your community, no matter where you live, no matter how high your gates are, and no matter how high your tuition is. It will impact your life as much as it impacts others. I would like to think that people would do it because it's humane and empathic, but we know better than that. So mine is a warning. This is going to be an issue that we are not going to be able to ignore for much longer and still be a healthy society.
Fantastic. I'm going to share a quick quote as we end, Julie. Woolfolk in his 2004 article wrote that social class is a significant dimension of cultural differences, often overpowering the differences such as ethnicity or gender. For example, upper class Anglo-European Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans often find that they have more in common with each other than they have with the lower class individuals from their own ethnic groups. So yes. This is that blindness that we have towards the us and the other mentality, particularly at the social class, is a very sensitive matter. And you're right. I think it's the gap as it widens, it's going to create a problem with the self-preservation. Well, I cannot thank you enough for your wonderful words of wisdom and coming on the show. I'm tremendously grateful to you, Julie.
Thank you, Sucheta. I like to talk.
Okay. Well, as I suspected, Sucheta, a fascinating conversation with Dr. Julie Washington. Wow. There's a very different perspective, as I thought would be the case with this conversation. Any initial thoughts you want to lead us off with?
Oh, absolutely, Todd. If you are listening to this podcast, chances are you don't live in poverty or suffer from disadvantages that we have discussed here. You have a smartphone and the ability to pay for the internet. You have time and resources to indulge in self-improvement. So in order to discuss the issues that Julie and I were talking about, or the general issues regarding poverty in America, we must first get our questions straight, So what comes to my mind is this is probably not a typical conversation when people are discussing executive function and, American policy or politics or American or general human condition, but I think it's worth giving it a shot. So the first question that comes to my mind is, what does poverty in America look like? And what does growing up poor in this country mean? And what are the common misconceptions about the poor? And what are the chronic effects of poverty on a person's psyche or a person's ability to get educated or receive resources or receive even compassionate attention? And finally, can educating the child from low socioeconomic environment get him out of poverty? So these are the things to think about. I know I am not an expert in that area, but I think talking to Julie, and generally this has been something I have been thinking about, has made me deeply connect to this issue as we discussed, Todd. So issues of race, class, and attitudes impact the way we engage with the poor and the marginalized. So here are things to think about. So first is poverty and race go together. 12% of US population is growing up in poverty, which means 39 million Americans out of approximately 326 millions don't earn more than $24,000 a year. On top of that, 30% of that group, which means 12 million Americans are African Americans. But the total population of African Americans in US is just about 42 million. And majority of the concentration of the African American population is in the South. So since I live in Atlanta, and which is the South, this deeply interests me, The second issue to think about is poverty and quality of America's future workforce go together. For example, Susan Newman, she's a professor of educational studies at the University of Michigan, has said that perhaps the first time in its history, America now has a caste-like underclass of underskilled and illiterate persons with no counterparts in Western world. I think this is a profound statement, and I'll kind of share with you quickly how that contradicts to our cultural beliefs regarding what should you do if you come from poverty. The third point that I was thinking about is poverty and policies go together. Pew Research published in 2012 that average real income of poor Americans has increased by less than 1%. But the fastest way to bleed the money is to pay rent. So, for example, in 2010, research shows that 6.2 million households spend more than 50% of their income on rent. I mean, can you imagine managing your rest of your expenses in the 50% income? And if you are a person at a level of poverty or below. So we as a collective group need to think about what is our fellow American going through and how can we relate and understand and even be part of the solution and not look at them as something they need to do on their own.
Well, gosh, listening to you there, Sucheta, I mean, I'm just thinking about every previous episode on this show and how I've always just viewed, as we've talked about how to help an individual with a problem with their executive function. I've always looked at them through the lens of a pretty well-to-do middle-class family, having the resources and frankly the time to address these issues. I can't even really put my head around dealing with these kinds of struggles when you're dealing with poverty. I mean, I can't even fathom that. It's almost overwhelming to me. So lots to think about there. So I imagine also while we're talking about poverty, I mean, there's probably different types of poverty. There's probably different ways to classify it. And I think that has to play a role in this conversation. Yes?
I really think so. And Julie and I didn't get a chance to discuss this, but I had done some research, and all poverty is not created equal. Fundamentally, there are two kinds of poverty classes, I guess: generational poverty and situational poverty, I guess you can think about. So generational poverty is defined as poverty that affects two or more generations. And most often the families in this group are receiving some sort of government support, such as welfare, and the kids are on some sort of free or reduced lunch program in school. Since uncertainty and survival is at the heart of these circumstances, individuals and families operate without a plan, and they tend to focus on short-term gains. As you can see, the self-management and self-control is devastatingly weakened by hardship and paucity. And as a result, there is an executive function deficit that's created or magnified by the financial insecurity and chronic unpredictability. The other important thing to think about that research shows that the values of those suffering from the situational versus generational poverty differ significantly. And here are some examples. Okay, Todd. Folks going through situational poverty have a different relationship to their condition. They recognize that this is a temporary condition. They work towards change in much more optimistic manner. They are much more cognizant of saving money and managing that money or investing that money towards the future. They tend to work towards achievement, security, stability, gathering some possessions that bring a sense of normalcy and even status. People in situational poverty tend to sacrifice temporary pleasures to accelerate life in a positive way, and they're focused on helping gain momentum in the direction of change. So those are the psychological and personal and effort conditions for a person who comes from situational poverty, or somebody who has lost a job and wife and children have left, and suddenly he begins to live in his car, that kind of thing. Now, on the other hand, the chronic and generational poverty can take a toll on one's psyche, and people may harbor a negative or a devastatingly poor attitude. The folks in generational poverty are hyper-focused on the present moment or the need of the present. The relationships, money, entertainment, all these things are viewed from the lens of now. And education is valued, but in a much more abstract way. But there's no concrete connection made between good education to stability in the future. And so fundamental skills associated with executive function include a sense of organization, time management, planning, sound decision-making, etc. So I think there's a real disconnect between those who are dealing with situational poverty versus chronic or generational poverty in the way they manage their future. As the president of Georgia Speech and Hearing Association, I'm involved in a project called GASHA Gives. My professional colleagues and I provide free language communication and cognition training to homeless adults who are going through job-related training. With a new set of skills, these men hope to gain control over their lives and build a new future for themselves. But since I've been working with them for past 8 months, I have a new understanding of what are the challenges that they're going through. Many, many of them are victims of generational poverty. You can see how that has impacted their capacity to control impulses and take good decisions. Researcher Gary Evans from Cornell has said that the timing and duration of exposure to poverty in childhood affects the development of the wholesome development of that person because of the parental investment, parental quality, and chronic stress, in addition to all the issues that I was describing before. So it's a very complicated matter, isn't it?
Oh, very, very much so. Goodness gracious. Well, we all understand, I think we all understand, I guess we should understand that being poor or living in poverty results in a daily life of distress. So, any comments around Dr. Washington's remarks on chaos and distress in children's lives?
Yeah, so that's what brings to, the discussion we were having, and all educators and people who have great interest and investment in children are thinking about that. Those living in poverty are often subjected to substandard conditions of living. There may be roaches or mold, leaks and clogs and unsanitary condition, overcrowding, too many people in one small room, not enough food, frequent starvation, a very little guarantee of satisfying or filling meals, even constant exposure to noise and chaos, and ongoing stressors like family being in turmoil or witnessing violence or violence against loved ones, constant threat of being separated from the family. And so all this leads to chronic stress condition. So research shows that these factors determine the relationship between childhood poverty and brain's capacity to activate the prefrontal cortex during emotional regulation. Recently I read a study that was done. It was a collaborative study where many researchers from various universities, UIC, Cornell University, University of Michigan, University of Denver, they all got together and they studied the brains of children at age 9 who are growing up in low family income. And they noticed that these children showed a lot less activity in the prefrontal cortex, which regulates negative emotions. And in fact, they notice greater activation in the amygdala area, which controls your emotional state. So what does that mean? That the researchers' comment was that the stress burden of growing up poor may be an underlying mechanism that occurs for the relationship between poverty as a child and how well your brain will work as an adult. So I think the harmful effects are clear, but they are not evident as a disability, or they don't generally generate a sense of love and care because it is exhibited through unacceptable behaviors, and that gets attention in a negative way. So what I'm trying to say that executive function is very critical in one's ability to manage themselves. But if you're constantly subjected to stress, then you're really not managing anything. You're just reacting instead of responding. And that's why it's really critical for us to think about at that important point.
All right. So before we go, Sucheta, any final thoughts?
So, Todd, the bottom line is this. Childhood poverty has harmful effects on overall development. But more importantly, the elevated and chronic state of stress has profound negative impact on child's well-being in specific and general human development throughout the entire course of lifespan. So children growing up in poverty experience long-standing stress and life of chaos. And the elevated chronic stress creates a disruptive disadvantage and creates a big challenge in that child being able to be consistent and demonstrate robust self-regulatory skills. So unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, these skills are essential that shape how we manage our environment and demands. And it allows us to adapt effortlessly and skillfully. But if you have very much pressure on those abilities that help you adapt and, adjust, then you are not adjusting and adapting to learn how to adjust and adapt, So it's a very complicated issue. So finally, this is the darker side of society, that the relationship between executive function and dysfunction needs to be understood and studied and respected. Time and again, I have discussed on my podcast that research is clear that poorly developed executive function cast a long shadow forward, lowering the quality of life and bring chronic disadvantage. So those who come from chronic disadvantageous situations have a risk of running a life of chronic disadvantage. So children are our future asset, and better prepared they are, stronger the nation's workforce and quality of our society's ability to manage those in trouble is. So invisible disadvantages created by poverty can no longer be ignored because it's a humanitarian and public health crisis, in my opinion, if you allow me to indulge in that thought process. So the destiny of our children growing up in poverty and chronic stress is nothing but them being stamped from the beginning. This is Kendi's book that has spoken to my heart. So we need to not only change our attitudes, we need to change policies, and we need to change the way we support those who are from these conditions.
Critically important conversation to have. And we can lift, by doing all this work that you're talking about, we can lift these people up and give them the empowerment to lift themselves out of poverty. It's just amazing stuff to think about. I'm so grateful that you had this a key part of your discussion on this show. And frankly, now I'm looking forward to next week's conversation with Dr. Washington. So that's it for today. Again, on behalf of our host, Sucheta, Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for tuning in and listening. We look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full Prefrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, Exposing the Mysteries of Executive Functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full Prefrontal.